morning, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. We're really happy to have so many of you from different organizations here today to learn more and engage on this really important topic. I'm Nina Papadopoulos, USAID Education Office's team leader for education in crisis and conflict, and I'm also the moderator for today's webcast. This webcast is brought to you by the USAID Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, or as we call it, USAID ECCN. This network is a community of practice composed of USAID implementing partners and many, many others working to increase safe, equitable access to and improve the quality of education in crisis and conflict affected environments. So during the next hour, we'll focus on the work of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. The coalition was founded in 2010 to advocate for the protection of students, teachers, schools, and universities from attack. Protecting education from attack and making learning environments safer for the millions of children and youth living in crisis and conflict settings is a top priority for many of us here today. And at USAID, a key component of our education strategy is to assure a safe learning environment, typically defined as a place where structured learning happens that is free from environmental, internal, and external threats to learners and education personnel's physical and emotional safety and well-being. The focus of this webcast is protecting students, teachers, schools, and universities from external threats, such as armed or violent attacks on learning environments and occupation of learning environment infrastructure by armed groups. So we'll begin the presentation with Dia Nijawan, Director of GCPEA, who will introduce the issue of attacks on education and military use of schools by highlighting the scope of the problem and the reasons for attack and military use of schools. Dia will then be joined by Margaret Sinclair. Margaret is GCPEA board member and technical advisor for Education Above All's Protect Education in Insecurity and Conflict. Margaret will provide guidance on what can be done to protect education from attack. Following the presentations, there will be time for questions. So before we get started, I'd like to orient everyone to the chat box on the right side of your screen. Please log questions for the presenters there, and we'll address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end. Questions that we cannot answer at that time and during the webcast will be posted on our website, and our panelists will be able to respond at a later time. So thank you so much again for joining us this morning.
Sorry, Dia, I think you're on mute.
I am on mute. Sorry about that. So I was just saying that it's a real pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to speak with you today, and thanking ECCN for facilitating this. And so, as Nina said, I'm Dia Nijawan. I'm with the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. And I think that people are most familiar with this issue of attacks on education through Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani schoolgirl who was shot in the head by the Taliban in 2012, and by the Chibok girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram in Nigeria in April 2014. So I think this is a great photo to sort of captures what we're working on here. But so I'd like to talk a little bit about just what the scope of this problem is of attacks on education. So in 2014, we produced a report called Education Under Attack. And we found that in conflicts around the world, schools are being deliberately bombed and burned. Students, teachers, education union workers, janitors who work in schools were being killed, raped, kidnapped. They're being recruited from school and on the way to school to be part of violent activity. And this is happening deliberately. They're not just being caught in the crossfire, often they're actually targeted for this attack. And then on top of that, of course, we're looking at indiscriminate bombing of schools and civilian neighborhoods, and there's a collateral damage to school that is happening in war zones around the world. So this is a problem that we're talking about, and unfortunately we don't know the full extent of the problem or the scope of the problem. The definitions of what attacks are vary from agency to agency that's collecting the data, so sometimes it's hard to compare information. And of course it's very difficult to collect statistics in the midst of conflict, and there's also no one agency that collects data globally. But what we found in our report is that between the period of 2009 to 2013, there were 70 countries in which attacks on education took place, and in 30 of them, there was a significant pattern of attacks. So this is a map of the countries where, the 30 countries that I'm talking about. And this was more than had ever been documented before, and we're not really sure whether that's due to better monitoring and reporting or better research or due to an actual increase in attacks. But we're also producing a report that's a follow-up report that will be Education Under Attack 2018, and our preliminary results have found that these attacks have not abated in any way, and of course there are now other countries where attacks are taking place, such as Ukraine. So in the period of 2009 to 2012, the most heavily affected countries were Afghanistan, Colombia, Pakistan, Somalia, Sudan, and Syria. And there were more than 1,000 incidents of attack or military use of schools, or over 1,000 students or educators who were victims of attack. So the question is, of course, how can we prevent these attacks, and how can we mitigate the impact of the attacks when they do take place? What can the responses be? But before we can really answer that question, we need to think about what the motivations are for those attacks. Why are they taking place? Because, of course, we can't, the reasons why they're occurring is obviously going to impact how we're able to respond to them. So what we found is that one of the reasons for attacks is ideological. So the attacks on Malala and by Boko Haram, for example. And more recent data shows that according to the UN Secretary General in April this year, there was an estimated 1,500 schools who had been destroyed, that had been destroyed in Nigeria since 2014, blocking the access to education for over 400,000 children. So in addition to the death and the injuries that are caused, of course, the impact on access to education is enormous. And in Afghanistan, as another example, a joint report by UNICEF and UNAMA found that in 2015, just 9 incidents of threats and intimidation regarding girls' education resulted in 50,000 girls not being able to go to school. So one reason is groups who perceive the education as being Western, or who ideologically oppose education of girls. Another reason for attacks is because schools are seen as state institutions and teachers as state employees or instruments of the state. So they're prime, soft, easy targets for anti-government forces. It's, of course, much easier to bomb a school than it is to bomb a military installation. Colombia was a country which was perhaps the most dangerous in which to be a teacher during the research period, and 140 teachers were killed between 2009 and 12, and over 1,000 received death threats, and that has been continuing to this day. Another reason for attacks is because of unequal access to education or curricula that are perceived to be discriminatory or privileging certain segments of the population at the cost of other segments. So, for example, in southern Thailand, there's an insurgency by the ethnic Malay Muslim population there against the dominant ethnic Thai Buddhist population in the rest of the country. And they see the curriculum as imposing the religious, cultural history and language also of this dominant society on their children. And in 2009 to 12, 59 teachers in southern Thailand were killed and numerous schools bombed. Sectarian violence also plays out in the schoolyard, and this is a photo of a school in Mektila, Myanmar, where in March of 2013, a mob of more than 200 Buddhist nationalist extremists torched the school, and they decapitated a student and killed 32 students and 4 teachers. Schools are also prime recruitment grounds for children, and Somalia was one of the countries where there was the highest number of recruitment during the period, where students were recruited and trained in schools. There was also evidence that girls were being abducted from the schools to serve as wives or sex slaves to Al-Shabaab. And in one instance, when 12 girls were taken from a school, a teacher reported that 150 dropped out. So you can see the impact in terms of the fear that's created when schools are targeted. Schools are also attacked because they're being used for military purposes. They're used as bases, barracks, weapons caches, torture centers, detention centers. There's a report by a boy in Afghanistan who said that he was detained and tortured in a school which he had formerly attended as a student. Some research that we did found that military use was occurring both by armed forces, so state armed forces, as well as non-state armed groups in 26 countries around the world where conflicts were taking place between 2005 and 2015. And this was actually the majority of countries in which there were conflicts during the last decade. When military use occurs, sometimes it occurs just on a temporary basis or just for a few days, but often it occurs for years on a pretty permanent basis. And in this case, in India, for example, in 2010, in northeastern India, in the conflict with the Maoist insurgents, government forces have reportedly used schools for many years. 129 schools were used in 2010 as bases and barracks, and this affected the education of 20,800 students. And in 2009, it was reported that a school had been used for over a decade. So although we might hear more about the bombings and the the targeting, the kidnapping of children, etc., from schools, and as horrific as that is, the numbers affected sometimes by military use can be much greater. Syria was the country with by far the greatest level of military use during the period reported on, and the government allegedly used approximately 1,000 schools as detention and torture centers, while the Free Syrian Army also allegedly used schools as bases and stored ammunition in them. And this, of course, is continuing to today. So what is the impact of attacks on education and military use of schools? In addition to the obvious impact of death and destruction of schools and injury to those impacted, there's really a pervasive sense of fear that leads to an exodus of students from the schools, as well as teachers also dropping out. As a result, there's diminished access to education, also because schools are forced to close or they're destroyed or badly damaged, and it can take years for them to be rebuilt after they've been attacked or used by military forces. There's lingering psychological distress, and there's narrowed opportunity due to less education, which of course has an impact on the entire community, sometimes for generations. There's also a disproportionate impact on girls because parents are particularly wary of sending their daughters to schools if they're occupied by armed men, or if there's a risk or perceived risk of attack by sexual violence at school or on the way to school. And there's a significant financial cost which really lays to waste all the money that donors are putting into education systems in conflict-affected countries. In South Sudan, for example, the education cluster estimated in 2011 that the cost of rehabilitating a school that had been used for military purposes was $67,000 US per school. And in March this year, the education cluster estimated that 40 schools were being used for military purposes in South Sudan. So, of course, this is an exorbitant amount of money in a country that has an education system that's already so compromised and doesn't begin to measure the costs of lost opportunities for students and communities. So, what can be done to protect education? That's really the question we're trying to address today. Unfortunately, there's very limited research on what's actually effective in protecting education. This is for a number of reasons. It's very difficult to research this issue in conflict-affected areas, and any funding that's available really goes to implementing measures for protection without any measurement of how effective they can be. So what we do know is really mainly coming from anecdotal evidence or from individual case studies. But even from that limited evidence, what we can deduce is that a holistic approach to protecting education is needed. Something that no one measure is going to solve the problem in any country around the world. A range of different types of measures is needed. And these measures need to include military actors, as well as legal actors, as well as education and protection practitioners on the ground. And the other thing that we are very sure of is that the context is absolutely critical. What works in one country might actually cause harm in another country. So what's needed is a range of measures by a range of actors that's put together in a coordinated way, tailored to the context, including the conflict dynamics in the country, the motivations for the attacks, as well as the community resources, the level of resilience, the particular skills within the community, and an understanding of what the government can provide as well. So what would this holistic approach include? First, there need to be measures to restrict the use of schools for military purposes. So this needs to be incorporated into the military doctrine through rules of engagement, through military orders, as well as through legislation preventing schools from being used. There also needs to be collection of data. If we don't know how many schools are being bombed, where they're being bombed, by whom, it's going to be very difficult to develop effective responses to the problem. So monitoring and reporting of attacks is critical, and systems developed at the national level to measure this is also very important. There also needs to be accountability for attacks. There needs to be investigations of attacks, and there needs to be prosecution of perpetrators. Psychosocial support is needed to rehabilitate victims of attacks, and they also need to be provided with the support to enable them to continue with their lives and move on and contribute back to society. Conflict-sensitive approaches to education must be promoted and implemented. So policies and programs that do not trigger more violence and conflict, but actually contribute to creating, to promoting tolerance, peace, and stability. And there needs to be also planning and policies put in place beforehand, before the attacks occur, so that they can address, ensure that education can continue during conflict, and that schools can be rebuilt once it's safe to do so. So that's sort of an outline of what would be a sort of a holistic approach to addressing this problem. The three first elements there are military and legal, and then the remainder are more focused on what the education community can do. And as I believe the majority of the participants today are from the education sector, I'm now going to pass the baton over to my colleague Margaret Sinclair to talk in more detail about what the education community can do to better protect education from attack. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dia, and welcome to all of you who are giving your time to participating in this webinar. So before going through the slides, I'll just say a few preliminary words to give some context. As Nina mentioned, I'm working with Education Above All Foundation in Qatar with the program called Protect Education in Insecurity and Conflict. We've been very active in the establishment of GCPEA and active members throughout. In 2011, the education people in the GCPEA steering committee decided to form a working group on field-based protective measures. And this group has prepared various studies and held a couple of technical workshops. Most recently, last October, we held a technical workshop in Istanbul with teams of education experts from ministries, NGOs, UN agencies from 10 countries to discuss practical measures to protect education from attack, to share good practice, to think about action plans, and also to review some draft materials on measures that can be taken at local level and at national level to enhance the protection of education from attack. So I'm going to present the findings of the report on protective measures at school level, at local level, which was prepared by Melinda Smith. She used to work for UNICEF, and she was the first coordinator of GCPEA. I'll also summarize the findings of a report by Cynthia Combs, who looked at Ministry of Education level measures. I want to just point out today, I think Dia just said this also, that we're not really dealing with evidence-based research on good practice. What we're doing is noting the various actions that have been taken in various places at various times and the contextual issues that have to be taken into account. And what seems beneficial in one location may indeed be harmful in another. So this type of conflict specificity means that research and evaluation, which I know is of interest to some of you, they're valuable. But in my personal opinion, they should be done in a particular context if it's a region where, a country where a lot of investment is being made to support education in times of conflict and insecurity. An example of such research was Knowledge on Fire, a study in 2009 for Afghanistan by CARE with support from the World Bank and the Ministry of Education. And just to point out that study was based on over 1,000 interviews involving nearly 5,000 people. So it was costly. And it identified key areas for the prevention of attacks in Afghanistan, such as community involvement, as well as noting the variation in attacks and responses across the country. So I'm very much encouraging such studies within countries, within a given context, where a big effort is being made or indeed is required. But I'm not sure that we can do global evidence on any particular measure being the best practice due to conflict specificity. And for that reason, in this study by Melinda Smith, which was discussed also with the working group, field-based working group of GCPEA, we decided to give one recommendation, actually, of good practice, which was for schools to prepare individual plans for safety and security related to that context. And I'll come to that at the end. But first I'll run through the findings of the study. So this is just a slide. These slides were from Melinda Smith, pointing out we're looking at school level, and that some activities at school level are done by the schools without any outside intervention, but many are generated through cooperative means, external support, and so on. So the next slide is really rather core to this discussion. And unarmed physical protection measures, we called it. A lot of the work that's done is through community action. And indeed, the Knowledge on Fire study respondents were saying that protection is a local responsibility. Essentially, communities have to protect their schools, their children. So what can communities do? Well, they can work through safety and protection committees, elders groups, shuras. And coming to the actions they can take, infrastructure is one example. Physical infrastructure, the study was citing boundary walls, which were seen, for example, as a safety measure for girls in Afghanistan. And in Pakistan, there's the recommendation now from the government for high walls topped by razor wire and other security measures, and similar ideas for Nigeria in recent times. But almost every measure has its pros and cons. And so in this case, the physical protection measures may be costly, and they may, in fact, invite attack, because then the school may be seen as a government institution, an elite institution, a militarized institution, or indeed the school may become somewhere where the military would like to come and sit in safety themselves. A different infrastructure example, one of the participants in our Istanbul meeting was Nagor Konde, from Sudan, southern Sudan, Nuba Mountains, and she was explaining that near to the schools there, they have prepared dugout shelters so that when the Antonov bombers come as part of the civil conflict, then the children can run from the school into the underground bunkers. So there's all types of physical protection. I see that on this slide it mentions demarcation of schools with symbols. And that is a no, 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 no. It's something that's often suggested, but it's not appropriate with conflicts which are based on hate and intolerance, because there may be a temptation to destroy the school of an opposing group. Going on to unarmed guards and volunteers, I think that's very widely used. And walking in groups to go to and from school is also widely used. Another point mentioned is teacher or student housing, so as to avoid the transit from home to school. But again, the con is that concentrating the students or the teachers in a particular location may make them more vulnerable to attack. And we saw the attacks in Chibok and in Garissa, where the students had dormitories. So now moving on to armed measures, basically armed guards. They've been used in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and southern Thailand. But they may invite attack. For example, in southern Thailand, the buses taking teachers and students to school get attacked. So the problem with armed guards is that they will probably be outgunned in this day and age. They can deter somebody with no real armaments, but if you have a convoy of heavily armed attackers, then they'll be overwhelmed. Community negotiations are possible in some circumstances, and quite famously, Afghan shuras negotiated with commanders to not attack the schools in a particular location or other. Likewise, schools are zones of peace in Nepal, where the schools negotiated with the Maoist guerrillas and the government forces and had a code of conduct for peace in the schools. But it can be dangerous, and it works when the attackers are local. It will not work if the attackers are driving in from far away. SMS early warning systems and alerts. So here, I think it's obviously going to be a growing thing. UNICEF has a system called EduTrack in the Central African Republic for education statistics, and that is being used to report attacks. And UNICEF also looked at SMS alerts in Mali, but the problem was phone coverage. And as we'll see in a chart later, schools in Gaza near the border with Israel have an SMS alert system. But at the moment, these things are costly, they require phone coverage, and they don't actually prevent harm to infrastructure. They simply warn people to get out of the way. Alternative delivery. I think we know about various ideas like relocating schools to the community and so on, which is not so easy if they're big schools. In Uganda in the past, whole schools were moved in northern Uganda from one place to the grounds of another school in a safer location. And other measures such as timings, temporary learning spaces, and distance learning is something which it's a big thing to set up distance learning. But some examples, for example, Melinda cited the response of government schools in Ukraine near to the fighting who kept education going by phone, email and Skype, localized response. Psychosocial support is a huge topic, and I'm not going to discuss it now. I know quite a number of participants are interested. Just to say that INEE Education Policy Working Group, the Education and Fragility Working Group it used to be called, is reviewing over 100 sets of psychosocial materials sent in by INEE members, and we'll be producing an overview and some guidelines from that. Just like to mention that I think there's still a gap. A lot of psychosocial activities are kind of extracurricular. They're not something you can fit in if it's a short shift. And I think Carl Triplehorn might be on this webinar, and he suggested long ago that the lessons themselves, the basic lessons, might, for example, be divided into smaller chunks for students who had difficulty concentrating. And this sort of thing, we still need to develop better guidelines for teachers. And I would also point out that in our own meetings, we often do psychosocial things like wave our arms about and so on, stand up and pretend we're trees. But this is something could be done quickly in literacy or maths lessons, and we don't give guidance yet sufficiently for that to happen. So here's the conclusion of Melinda's study, Comprehensive School Safety and Security Planning. And I think, you know, it's obviously including the various elements that we've just discussed, and assessment of risks, and then preparedness, response, and recovery. So to save time, I'll go on. This is an example from the border schools in Gaza, near to Israel, where they have preparedness plans, and they have like an SMS tree for use to alert parents if it's dangerous for children to come to school and so on. And then they have, that's response, and they have recovery with psychosocial, etc. So now I'm summarizing the report very quickly from Cynthia Coons on ministry level protection of education from attack. And again, it's fairly obvious from what we've said before that it includes analyzing the situation, securing the schools, whatever measures the, sorry for that. Very fine tuning this little device for adjusting the slides. Here we are. Continuity of education by one means or another, systematized protection, maybe have a focal point in the ministry and at subnational levels, help schools to prepare school plans, which of course is many schools will find difficult, and strengthening the school management committee's capacity for risk reduction. Then, of course, education can be a driver of conflict. What can we do to prevent that and encourage education to support peace? So the point here, we need political will to change anything about education. We should have more conflict-sensitive curricula with practical, easy-to-use materials, conflict-sensitive language of instruction policies, conflict-sensitive education planning, which we've been cooperating with UNESCO International Institute of Education Planning on this. You can check their website for materials that have been developed. They're in the resources mentioned at the end of this display. Teacher deployment and financing policies. And then this third slide is what the ministries can do outside of themselves. They can argue for action, more legal action about attacks on education. They can take up issues with government entities. For example, in some countries, schools are used as polling booths for elections, which is common, but if the country is insecure, then you may have attacks on the schools, and teachers are killed and schools destroyed, for example, in southern Philippines, in this situation. And advocating with military counterparts to protect the schools and not use them. So in conclusion, from GCPEA side, we believe in a holistic approach looking at military, legal, and education actors and improved monitoring and reporting of attacks and accountability. And within the education sector, our priority recommendations are to support schools in developing local plans for safety and security. And here I will add in that I think that the plans should be, we have to think about all safety and security in the school. It should include fire drills, disaster risk reduction activities, gender safety, and protection from attack. We have to integrate those holistically into school safety and security plans, and for the longer term to develop crisis-sensitive education policies, planning and curriculum, so that education is less of a driver of conflict and contributes to future peace and security.
Well, I just want to thank Margaret and Dia so much for this really, really rich discussion. And I want to encourage everyone online, please send us your questions or your comments. We have about 10 or 15 minutes to have a more detailed discussion with Margaret and Dia. So our first question has come in from Liz Wilson. And I think this is directed at Margaret. So building conflict sensitivity into curriculum is definitely important. How can governments and those of us working with them take action on getting this done? And do you have any examples of how this has worked well?
It's very, very difficult to change education curricula anywhere in the world. It takes a lot of political will. I've had the good fortune to do some work on this with Uganda, where there is a national conflict and disaster risk reduction policy, including a special policy for education. And within that context, we were able to work with the Curriculum Development Center to develop reading materials and so on that incorporated the basic life skills for conflict resolution, respect for diversity, and so on, as well as disaster risk issues. So it is something which I feel should be seen as a cross-cutting issue that similar to gender, which should be taken into account in the new generation of textbooks and reading materials, which I see is coming up with the new Sustainable Development Goals, primary and secondary education for all, and Target 4.7 of education for sustainable development, culture of peace, and so on.
Thanks, Margaret. And I have another question. I think, either one of you could answer this one. In the U.S., Kenya, and Pakistan, and other countries, there have been recent deadly shootings and attacks on university campuses. Do you have any insights on have there been any effective responses from governments, universities, or even local communities to effectively improve safety of students and staff in higher education?
Dear, do you want to talk about the higher education working group?
Well, sure. What we have developed at GCPEA through a working group with higher education actors is a set of principles of state responsibility for protecting higher education from attack. And what that tries to do is sort of reiterate what already states have committed to through humanitarian and human rights law, but to reinforce the fact that states have this responsibility that they've got to take action to protect higher education, which sometimes gets missed. So the higher education, of course, is the same, but also quite different from other levels of education, in that the reasons for attack are often more political, in that the groups might oppose the research that's been conducted by academics, and also because higher education institutions are seen as locations where there's discussion and dissent and sort of a hotbed for activity that might be focused against the government. So there's a level of motivation for attacks that doesn't often exist for lower levels of education. So the measures that we've been talking about would apply also to higher education, but they would have to be tweaked a little bit also to take into account the fact that there's an added level of targeting of schools. In terms of specific examples of what particular universities have done to better protect the sector, there's a lot of debate again about whether about the armed guards aspect of it. We had a participant from Kenya who was a professor at the Garissa University, which was attacked. And his opinion was that if there had been stronger and more armed guards at the university, that perhaps they would have been able to do something. This, of course, was disputed by other participants. So I can't give you anything concrete in terms of what really good practice. But Margaret, I don't know if you have any examples of places where they've really put in some sort of measures that have been effective to date.
No, I think for all protection, it has to be context-specific and common sense, and the most motivated people are the people in the institution. So we have to put into their hands the ideas that they may not have considered and so on, and think about funding things they need. But in the end, they have to take account of the context and the logistics and so on. They should have a plan.
So we have another question that's come in from my colleague, Yolande Miller-Granvaux. And Yolande asks, is there research conducted on whether risks are mitigated differently for females versus males, both in terms of teachers and students? I'm not sure who would like to take this, but maybe, if there's not research, are there some examples, or do we have any insights on this?
Regarding the statistics, you know, the statistics on attacks on education, there's very little gender, very limited gender data. So although we've been trying to think about gender and attacks and protection, but it would need case studies and so on. It's not available, it's not just out there for this study to find. And it's not obvious, but it's on our mind, yes.
And we do know that there, you know, that females are attacked in different ways, and that the impact on them is different. And I mentioned military use of schools, for example, that they're just as in other sectors of society, the women and the girls are the ones who are going to be, you know, who are going to drop out of school earlier, and the impact on them of dropping out in terms of child marriage, in terms of, you know, contracting diseases, in terms of entering prostitution and so forth, are amplified. So we're aware of all those types of problems, but as Margaret says, there hasn't yet been sort of specific research on the issue. What we're hoping to do is prepare some sort of a briefing paper where we can look at the research that has been done in other sectors, gender studies, or you know, women in health, women in other intersecting sectors, and use that lens to apply it to attacks on education specifically. But that hasn't yet been done, but is an area that we see as a priority in the future.
Another great question that just came in from Shai Fuchsman. It seems that conflict-sensitive education is an important step to make education safer, and it just keeps coming up, you know, again and again and again. Do you have examples of education practices that were changed to make them more conflict-sensitive? What worked, and what were some of the biggest challenges? And I think, Margaret, I'm going to throw this to you because you did mention a few things, a few examples earlier.
Yes, it's very fascinating, and I hope my colleague from UNESCO International Institute of Education Planning will not be upset when I say that it's not easy. For example, they have been doing trainings, workshops, even at district level in Uganda, in some districts, and so they have really worked towards the creation of education plans at school level, which are built on vulnerability analyses, district level vulnerability analysis, school level vulnerability analysis, plans for action. But to say that it has so far proved successful, that's something very different, and almost that you're trying to prove a negative. By integrating disaster with conflict in that sort of setting where there are a tremendous lot of disasters, unfortunately, the schools have become very much interested, and I hope that it will constitute a model. But changing curriculum is difficult, changing education plans to have better access by particular identity groups who have a grievance about lesser access to education. That's difficult because it's a political issue. Can we disguise it with some statistics as a statistical issue and get more resources allocated where it's needed and so on? Crisis, conflict-sensitive education is very good if there's political will at the top. And without that, it's quite difficult.
Thanks, Margaret. We're really getting some great questions in from our participants. Mark Lind has written in, and he's asking, do any frameworks or checklists exist that provide guidance on how to enter a situation in order to help people or communities working within these contexts, and to help us understand how to interpret, for example, the stage nature of conflict, and the appropriate approaches necessary?
Well, I would say there are some tools. I think that USAID has some tools for analysis of the situation, and So if you're coming from outside, then you definitely must, you know, put a lot of effort into the conflict analysis. And I think UNICEF's peace building project over the last 4 years, they started in every one of the 14 countries with a conflict analysis, so as to avoid making things worse, shooting themselves in the foot and so on. Do you?
No, I don't have anything to add to that, unfortunately. Sorry.
That's okay. Your face showed on the screen, so I thought meant you were.
So here we have a Margaret. You mentioned Carl Triplehorn earlier. We have a question from Carl. What are the easy baby steps that can be taken? Small steps such as banning guns from education institutions. In my home state, we're debating the banning of guns from campuses.
It's very much the case that my colleagues frown if there's any talk of having armed guards or armed anything in the school. But it may be that in some situations, you know, people will feel better if they have that. I think it's very context specific, and if we had the arms in the school, it would be for specific people to undertake protective measures, not for students and teachers to carry, I think. Perhaps in Pakistan, they actually want the teachers to carry guns. But then it's a little bit more of the culture in Pakistan.
I think the other thing sort of connected to that is also asking the community as a starting point in terms of these baby steps or first steps to take. First, to get the context part of it, and because they're the people that are so impacted, they often have the best ideas to begin with in terms of what can be done at the local level.
Thanks. We have a question from Deborah. Deborah asks, do you have examples of programs in northern Nigeria that build on some of the examples or approaches that you have previously suggested? Again, what has worked, and what suggestions do you have for Nigeria's conflict-affected context?
I have one example, which is not so, which is a military type of example of something very simple, where instead of the army has made a concerted effort there not to go into the schools and to occupy them, and they've just sort of they've erected tents, and so the army is now occupying those tents rather than going into the school, which seems like a very simple no-brainer type of solution, but it actually has a lot of significant consequences that they've taken that measure.
So I'm going to push this one more question that I think is really important to pose. This is from Meryl Jordan, who works at IBTCI. IBTCI works to monitor conflict. How can we compare data from one conflict to another to provide concrete results for donors and hopefully implementers? What advice do you have to an organization that's collecting data on conflict?
So in terms of, this is the data I'm talking about is about specifically on attacks on education, and in fact under the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the, I think it's Sustainable Development Goal number 4, there's some sort of a target where they're actually now committing to collect data on attacks on education, which would be phenomenal, as it would mean that UNESCO would actually have to go out there and collect this data in all the different countries that they're working in. It's going to be a complicated thing to do, and they're going to have to start by sort of coming up with a definition of attacks on education that can be accepted by all and can also be put into practice. So I think it's I think it's a work in progress, but it's something that has already started to happen. They have working groups on this, and they're actually trying to figure out how they're going to collect that data. And one source that they're going to use is this report, Education Under Attack, and the new one that's coming up.
Thank you, Dia. I'm gonna push in one more question before we wrap up. Margaret, John John Acker is asking if you could mention a little bit more the engagement of UNESCO in the study that you mentioned earlier.
Hi, John. I'm a little bit lost whether this is the, which study it is, whether it's the IIEP study. Yeah, we work closely with UNESCO whenever we can, and in particular from our side, we work with the International Institute of Education Planning on conflict-sensitive education planning for disaster and conflict risk reduction.
And I should add that UNESCO is a member of the coalition, and so they participated in the 2 papers that GCPEA produced on what schools can do to protect education and what ministries of education can do. And so some of the examples are drawn from their experience, particularly that case study that Margaret was mentioning from Gaza was a UNESCO-supported program, actually. And so all our partners, we bring in the examples, we try and find what they've been doing that's been working and then put it into these reports.
All right, thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Dia. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and engaging with us on this really important topic. I can tell from the questions that have been posed that this is something that there are a lot of folks and organizations that are quite passionate about this topic. And you'll see some helpful resources on protecting education from attack here. On this slide, which will also be available on our website. And we're also going to post a recording of this webcast and the slide deck on the USAID ECCN website in order for you to access the links. As I mentioned, any questions that we couldn't address, and we did get some other good questions that we couldn't throw out there, they will be answered on our website as well. So we'll coordinate with Dia and Margaret for those questions that were not answered. I wanted to draw your attention to USAID ECCN's forthcoming Safer Learning Environments Evidence Gap Maps. The purpose of these gap maps is to visually demonstrate areas in which further evidence should be generated and how to make learning environments safer. As we learned from Dia and Margaret, you know, we may not have generalizable findings from one country to another, but I think it's really important that we can identify principles, and we do need to study and evaluate what those principles are related to interventions that are attempting to make schools safer. The gap maps will be published on the USAID ECCN website in late July, so please stay tuned for the release of these important tools. And with that, I'd like to thank the speakers today. Thank you, Dia and Margaret. It's been such a pleasure and such an honor to have you on today with us, and we look forward to more in-depth conversations, especially as we try to build the evidence base around this issue. So thank you for taking the time out of what is surely your hectic schedules to join us today. Have a great day, afternoon, or evening to everyone out there. Thank you.